Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we are remembering October 7th, 1 year later. Let's get started. I think every one of my listeners probably remembers where they were exactly when they found out what was going on in Israel on October 7th, 1 year ago. Being that it's October 7th, 1 year later, I thought that this episode is going to mark what's been going on for the last year. Where are we now? What's changed, for better or for worse? And sadly, as most of you probably already know, it's much worse. We have all seen, literally, since October 7th last year, protests on a regular basis, coming from the anti-Israel groups, walking down streets of major cities all over the world with their keffiyehs on and their masks, and essentially calling for the genocide of Jews and the end of Israel as a whole. It's become far too comfortable and normalized. I know many of us Jews hoped something would change, that, this was just an aftermath of a big event. Eventually the politicians and the police will sort this stuff out, and we're about a year later, and it only seems to be getting worse. Some countries have fared a little bit better, and some much worse than we expected. As an example, Germany, that have the most strict anti-Semitism laws in the entire world, for obvious reasons, considering their unfortunate past, and the fear of getting back to that spot again, because, as we all know, if you forget your history, you are doomed to repeat it. Sadly, they're the only ones who figured this out. Other countries like the United States and Canada, for example, have really struggled with how to balance the free speech aspect, which is very important, but also the hate crimes and the threats against the Jewish community and their rights to be free of hate on their campuses, in their places of worship, and even walking down the street. Some places have gone so far in the wrong direction to recently be caught on video, like in Canada, telling Jewish people they weren't allowed in certain areas for their fear that they might be attacked by the ravenous mobs of people who hate the Jews. So therefore, let's keep the Jews away from them and allow them to occupy territory, rather than dealing with the root cause, which is the terrorism-inspired hate on the other side of this argument. And obviously we could talk about the encampments themselves, which we all are far too familiar with. Thankfully, those were eventually, after far too long, taken down by courts and other things, but the damage was done. And these people have seen that they have the ability to essentially do whatever they want, and the government and people will not stop them. And what's most unfortunate about this situation is the fact that it's not like the governments don't realize what's happening. They obviously realize what's happening. Recently in Toronto, Canada, for example, the police chief came out with a statement proving that hate crimes are way up in the Toronto area, along with the specific fact that Jewish groups have been targeted almost 70% higher than previous years. So there's a dramatic rise in the hate against Jews, and then the mayor of Toronto comes out with a both sides statements. We are sad to hear about what's going on in the Jewish community, but also the Muslim community and pro-Palestinians and things of that nature. A way to make sure that they don't get caught actually supporting Jews, which is going to be a theme of this podcast episode. You'll hear a little bit later where this theme comes up again. We don't want to be seen helping Jews too much because we might be seen as being too pro-Jewish. But back to the protesters. As many of you probably have seen in your own communities, there are many protests being called for October 7th. Now, we call them protests because they're supposedly protesting Gaza and the war there, but are they really? We've seen posters for university campuses. All the high school groups are going out on October 7th to protest what's going on in Gaza. Except it's a very interesting date they chose. I pointed this out on our social media at jdr.podcast. If you were going to try and maybe commemorate or mark the day of the Gaza conflict, technically speaking, that didn't start for days or even weeks after the October 7th attack. So why are protests happening to protest Gaza, and you choose the date of the massacre that the Hamas people did that you, of course, do not support, or at least that's what you claim? Why would you choose October 7th unless you are going not to protest, but to celebrate the October 7th, to rub it in the face of the Jews and the people who support the Jews. That's why you're choosing October 7th. And it's not really even a secret anymore. We see the protests have changed from when they first started, by the way, on October 8th, before Israel had a boot on the ground in Gaza. All around the world, people went out in the streets to say, we're not celebrating the death of Israelis. What we're really doing is celebrating the resistance of the Gazan people to get over their apartheid, blah, blah, blah. That's what they claimed at first. The funny thing about a conflict that lasts this long, we usually don't have wars in the Middle East that last this long. They're much shorter. The Israelis are typically forced into a ceasefire with terrorist groups for a certain amount of time until it happens again. But the length of time that this has been going on for, and the fact that Israel has somewhat resisted the idea of a permanent ceasefire, it has allowed the truth to come out. The truth, for example, like I talked about last week on our podcast, with the African American community, who realized after, unfortunately, far too long, how they used to support the issues in Gaza, but then realized how they were wrong because they had enough time to look into the reality of the situation. Had this conflict not lasted as long as it did, they probably wouldn't have known and then would have continued their passion and support for a cause that cares little about them. On that same note, we see the people who are around the world who normally would come out and protest for a week or two until the ceasefire and then go back to their regular lives, have now either gone one of two ways. One, they've probably gone back to their regular lives because really they don't care about the situation, or they revealed their true feelings, where it went from I'm supporting the people of Gaza against a supposed genocide to just flat out antisemitism. We saw little trickles originally about a year ago with people calling for support of Hamas, claiming, no, we're about the Palestinians, but also supporting Hamas. We're not terrorists, but also supporting Hamas. And they tried to brush that under the rug like it was no big deal. But as this conflict has gotten longer and these protests have gotten more crazy, now you're seeing flat out support for terrorism in the streets of North America and of Europe. You see people waving Hezbollah flags, calling on Hezbollah to kill all Israelis. You've seen them holding pictures of the Iranian leader in Western civilizations, the same Western civilization that Iranian leader would love to kill. And they're supporting him. The facade that they once had, that usually only lasts a few months, the one that pretends that they don't support terrorists and are just about the people, is now completely gone. It's washed off. The makeup is off the pig. Those who are still left protesting in the streets, and sadly there are far too many, are doing it because they are anti-Israel, and facts don't matter. Some might still be brainwashed, but after this long, to see all of the facts and the realities of how Hamas treats the people of Gaza, how Hamas did all of the things that they claim didn't really happen, all the evidence is out there. We see movies coming out now, documentaries, books being written. There is no doubt that anybody with half a brain would understand what went on October 7th. And if you're still supporting it and not calling out Hamas and not realizing that Hamas is the problem for Israelis and Hamas is the problem for the Palestinian Arabs, if you don't realize that by now, I hate to say you're either really brainwashed or really stupid. And I guess, like most people on their best behavior, eventually it wears off. And eventually the truth comes out. We saw these people get a taste for blood with the whole encampment thing. Oh, we can actually be anti-Semitic in open public now? We can spit on Jews and kick them off campuses and treat them really badly and do all of these things in a, quote, passive-aggressive way? This is amazing. And now they're just getting to do it freely because governments are too scared or unwilling to deal with it. And I'm sure it doesn't help that in the United States and within Canada, there are elections coming up. And therefore, people have to be a little bit worried about who they support. Maybe it'd be different if there wasn't an election coming up. People are just way too afraid to deal with this topic. They will not touch it. Politicians kind of both sides it as best they can. Some ignore it. In some cases within Canada, our leadership unfortunately went out and told their people, hey, if you have Muslim people in your region, you can tell them whatever they need to hear in order to get their votes. And if you have Jewish people in your region that you govern, you can tell them what they need to hear. We'll literally tell everybody anything just to be elected. And this is the state of politics. Leaders don't want to pick a side or decide what is right from wrong. Let everyone decide for themselves what is right and wrong. There is no right and wrong anymore. Everyone just wants to sort of keep their hands off it, not talk about it, and just get through this time with as little damage as possible. And this leads me to one of the saddest issues that I've been dealing with recently. As many of you know who've listened to this podcast before, you know that this past summer I went on an educator's trip to Israel to go visit the October 7th sites. If you haven't listened to those episodes, they are amazing episodes. Please go back and listen to them. It's about my mission. There's 2 parts. They're unfortunately very graphic and very long. Please go back and listen if you haven't heard them before. But on this trip, I met a lot of educators. And so many of us have been working together on how to deal with the October 7th aftermath, how to deal with the education system and the way everything's working. Unfortunately, here in Canada, we've had a lot of problems in education. For any of my listeners who've been with me for a while, but maybe not too long, if you go back to episode 60 called We Can't Talk About Our Jewish History, you can listen to an episode I did about the fact that I'm a teacher and we have such issues within the education system around Jewish history. But what's changed since then is October 7th. Since then, the school boards that were already kind of iffy on the whole Jewish thing and talking about Jewish history have doubled and even tripled down on the not talking about Jewish history, especially about the October 7th history. Myself and other educators who went on this trip to be able to educate people on what we saw. And we have hit a brick wall when it comes to talking about our issues, talking about what we saw, giving the other side of the narrative. And as I said in my podcast from way back about teaching, the education system is very much today about experience. You share your experiences, you share your history, you share why you look at things through this certain lens. And that is so important to people getting to know one another and understanding and sympathy and empathy. But when it comes to Jews, we're not allowed to do that. And it's because how I suggested in that last podcast that my existence as a Jew offends people. For those people who don't keep up with Canadian politics, we've had a little bit of a skirmish going on within Canada's politics when it comes to the Israel-Gaza issue. Recently, the Toronto District School Board had a little bit of a problem when a teacher from the school board took their students on what was supposed to be a field trip to a First Nations protest. And this First Nations protest was supposed to show them about occupation and all this other stuff and the history of Canada. We do, as Canadians, have an unfortunate past, as many do, with the Indigenous people. But this teacher, apparently, knowingly, went behind the school's back and planned on bringing her students to a pro-Palestinian rally and have the students go and cheer and chant for pro-Palestine and didn't tell any of the parents about it. It was supposed to be a First Nations thing. And then an email was leaked that said that this teacher warned their students to wear certain clothing depending on if they were a, quote, occupier or not. And there's some debate on why she chose the color blue for occupation, maybe because she knew she was going to a anti-Israel rally, and therefore any Jewish or supporters of Israel would have to wear blue and single them out in the class. But this was obviously something that shouldn't be happening in our schools. And yet it's under investigation. We're going to see if this teacher should be punished for what she had done. Most parents are extremely unhappy with this. But that's not the only situation we're facing within the education system in Canada. We also have one school board for an area within the Greater Toronto area that is promoting Nakba Day on their calendars. Yes, you heard that correct. Nakba Day. They've added to their calendars as an official day to be recognized in schools. First of all, I don't think anybody other than Palestinian Arabs, quote unquote, celebrate or remember Nakba Day. So a board within a Canadian education system is apparently the only place in the entire world to recognize it, just because they apparently have a very high Muslim population. Can you imagine being a Jewish teacher in that school board, having to teach about Nakba Day because it's on the school board's calendar? This is literal insanity. The school is really not a place for this type of thing. And that essentially is the grounds that this October 7th will fall on. This hyper-partisan, certain school boards are too afraid to touch things, other school boards are going crazy and allowing for Nakba days in their schools. And yet Jewish teachers are confused. How do I deal with this? Many of my fellow teachers who I went on my trip with are hoping to mark the day with some type of ceremony with the Jewish students and supporters in their schools. Maybe talk about the day, maybe figure out how people are feeling about the day, whatever it might be. And yet the school boards essentially have said, under no circumstances are you allowed to do that. You cannot talk about October 7th. You cannot take a minute of silence for October 7th. That has no place within an education system. Apparently the same education system that thinks that talking about the Nakba is totally fine. It seems a little one-sided here. I get that boards are stupid. We don't know which one to support, so let's not talk about it at all. I don't really fully agree with it, but nonetheless, if that's your policy, that's your policy. However, at the same time, we have pro-Palestinian students, in secondary mostly, but all over, being brainwashed into doing what they're calling the walkout for Gaza. So they chose October 7th to do a walkout, which the students apparently are able to just walk out of the school and leave to go, quote unquote, protest Israel in the streets. And education system essentially is like, look, that's free speech. They're allowed to do whatever they want. We don't want to get in the way of that. But meanwhile, telling other students who are Jewish that you are not allowed to do that. You are not allowed to have an October 7th walkout or memorial or anything like that. But if you want to go walk out for Palestine, apparently, we can't stop you. I was pointing out to a friend recently how uncomfortable it would be if you can just imagine this. Imagine you're a Jewish teacher, if you're a Jewish student, and you go to class on October 7th and nobody's there, and you and maybe one other student happen to be in class because all of your classmates have just walked out, quote unquote, for Palestine. How would you feel in your school after that? Can you imagine what it would feel like to know your students or your classmates are anti-Israel people, are maybe even anti-Semitic in some ways? To be fair, most of the students just want a free day off school, which is a whole other problem. But think about the fact that there's no punishment for leaving class, for alienating the Jewish students in a school. I have heard that some Jewish parents are just keeping their students home on October 7th to avoid the trauma of either being alone in a classroom by themselves or having to witness which friends that they thought were friends are apparently anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. Could you imagine this happening for literally any other cause other than against the Jews and it being acceptable? And meanwhile, the school boards are pretending like they have nothing to say about it because they were so afraid of the backlash of supporting one side or the other, or making any type of decision about morality and right from wrong. And I think, personally, it's because they're too afraid to seem pro-Jewish. Just like the politicians, just like everyone else in society, there is a default to go towards the anti-Semitic side. Just to seem like I'm not too pro-Jewish, like I'm not standing up for the Jewish people too much, I'm going to go extra anti-Jewish, so that way no one can accuse me of being pro-Jewish. In this day and age, neutrality appears to some as supporting the Jews a little too much. And how that looks in reality is politicians and education ministers and boards saying, look, we can't stop people from protesting anything about Gaza or about Israel or whatever, but we definitely are not going to allow you to commemorate October 7th because that's way too pro-Jewish. If we allow that, people are going to accuse us of supporting genocide and being colonizers and whatever else they're going to say about us. So instead, we're going to say it's free speech to talk about Palestine, but no talking about October 7th. The cowardice of the governments, of people in power, to literally refuse to deal with the Jewish issues, the safety concerns within Jewish communities, the rampant anti-Semitism and hate we are seeing in the streets, the keffiyeh wearing to make sure that people know that you virtue signal on the right side of this and that you hate Jews so that way when they pass you by, they know you hate them. This kind of thing is just being allowed to happen. This is the post-October 7th world. In the end, it has been, honestly, a terrible year for the Jewish community. We are seeing rampant anti-Semitism. We are seeing politicians that could care less about what's going on and are allowing themselves to go to the anti-Israel side to appear as though they are not supporting the Jewish community too much or an unreasonable amount, so therefore they go against the Jewish community. We are seeing students and teachers and pretty much Jews across the spectrum being hung out to dry by employers, by school boards, by politicians, essentially left on their own. And the police are trying their best. They're trying to put a Band-Aid on a situation that politicians refuse to touch. They are making sure that Jews stay away from the people who want to kill them. They're making sure that the people who want to kill them are being kept away from Jewish community centers and synagogues, but it really is just a Band-Aid. And I guess the question in the end of this is this ever going to go back to quote unquote normal? Will we and can we ever get back to a place where these rabid anti-Semitic people who have had a taste for blood will ever just stop doing what they're doing? Do we think that when Israel finally wins at the current war that they're in, that these people are going to stop being anti-Semitic? Probably not. And if anything, it seems to be just getting worse. Let's hope on this October 7th, when you're possibly listening to this podcast, or maybe the day or two after, that you'll take the moment to reflect on this year, on how you can improve the lives of those around you, how you can make October 7th hopefully a day to remember for positive actions, good deeds you've done, helping others, rather than the unfortunate thing that Hamas put on the Jewish community on October 7th 1 year ago. I'll quote the amazing and strong parents of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, who said that Hirsch's death should be a revolution, a positive revolution of peace, love, caring, and hopefully solutions to some of these issues we're facing. Go out and do a good deed today and be kind to others. That is our best weapon against the hate and evil in this world right now. And for my non-Jewish listeners out there, today might be a great day to reach out to your Jewish friends and ask them if they're doing okay and tell them that you're there for them. It means more to them than you can ever imagine. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.